Before a single safety regulation existed for motorcycles, before helmets were mandatory anywhere in the world, before anyone had even studied what actually happens to a human skull at 80 miles an hour, manufacturers were already building machines faster than any road, any rider, and any piece of protective gear could safely handle. Some of those motorcycles earned nicknames that still make collectors go quiet when they're mentioned today. And behind almost every single one of those nicknames is a real person who paid the price for riding a machine that was, quite simply, built faster than the era around it was ready for. This isn't just a list of dangerous old motorcycles. This is the story of the men who died finding out exactly how dangerous they were, and in more than one case, what their deaths ended up teaching the entire world about survival. Let's start in England, in the spring of 1935, with a motorcycle so respected it was nicknamed the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, the Brough Superior SS100. This wasn't some reckless factory experiment. It was a meticulously hand-built, hand-tested luxury machine. Each one signed off personally by its own test rider before delivery, capable of a genuinely staggering 100 miles an hour at a time when most cars on the road couldn't even manage half that speed. One of its most famous owners was a man the entire world knew as Lawrence of Arabia, the British officer and writer whose desert campaigns had already made him something close to a living legend. Lawrence loved speed, the way some men love danger itself, and by 1935 he owned his 7th Brough Superior, having quite literally worn out the previous 6. On the morning of May 13, 1935, Lawrence was riding along a quiet country road near his cottage in Dorset when he came around a dip in the road and found 2 boys on bicycles directly in his path. He swerved hard to avoid them. In doing so, he lost control of the motorcycle and was thrown violently over the handlebars, suffering catastrophic head injuries on a road that, just moments earlier, had felt completely empty and safe. He never regained full consciousness. He died 6 days later. Here's the part of this story that most people never hear. One of the neurosurgeons who treated Lawrence in his final days, a man named Hugh Cairns, became so disturbed by the sheer number of similar head injuries he'd already been seeing among motorcycle riders, especially young military dispatch riders during the war, that he began a formal medical study into exactly what was killing so many riders in crashes that otherwise should have been survivable. His research became one of the earliest serious scientific arguments for wearing a protective helmet on a motorcycle, and it directly influenced military policy on crash helmets within just a few short years. In a strange, quietly tragic way, the death of one of the most famous men in England on one of the most beautiful motorcycles ever built ended up saving the lives of countless riders who came after him and never even knew his name. But the Brough Superior wasn't dangerous because it was poorly built. It was dangerous because it was simply too far ahead of the roads, the tires, and the safety knowledge of its own era. That same problem would repeat itself again and again over the following decades, as manufacturers kept chasing bigger numbers without always stopping to ask whether ordinary riders on ordinary roads could actually survive what they were building. Take the Vincent Black Shadow, released in 1948 and immediately crowned the fastest production motorcycle in the entire world, a title it would hold for years. This was a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering, a big, powerful V-twin capable of embarrassing sports cars in a straight line, but it arrived at a moment when brake technology simply hadn't caught up with engine technology anywhere in the industry. Drum brakes designed for far slower machines were now being asked to stop a motorcycle capable of speeds that terrified even experienced riders of the era. Owners quickly learned to respect a very specific rhythm with this machine: accelerate hard, and then start planning your stop, long before you actually needed it, because there simply wasn't a way to change your mind at the last second, the way modern riders take for granted today. Vincent owners quickly learned that this machine rewarded confidence and punished hesitation in equal measure. And more than a few riders who bought one purely for bragging rights found out the hard way that the Black Shadow's biggest danger wasn't how fast it could go. It was how long it took to stop once you got there. Period road tests from the era, giddy with excitement over the top speed numbers, often buried a much quieter warning somewhere near the bottom of the article that this motorcycle demanded a level of respect and anticipation that very few riders on the road at the time had ever actually needed to develop before. Then, decades later, on the other side of the world, Kawasaki built a motorcycle that would come to define an entire era of two-stroke excess, the legendary H2 Mach IV, better known in America simply as the Widowmaker. This bike didn't hide what it was. It made no attempt at civility. Below 5,000 RPM, it rode like a completely normal, well-mannered machine. And then, without warning, the power would arrive all at once. The front wheel would lift off the ground even when the rider wasn't asking for it, and a motorcycle with a chassis and brakes barely capable of handling half that power would suddenly be doing things its own frame was never designed to survive. Riders who understood exactly what they were sitting on could tame it. Riders who didn't often found out the difference between respect and fear. The same way Lawrence's neurosurgeon had been trying to warn an entire generation about decades earlier, in a hospital bed, too late to do anything but learn from it. And if you think that's as reckless as it gets, wait until you hear what Suzuki was doing at almost exactly the same time in the world of off-road racing. The Suzuki TM400 Cyclone arrived with a marketing philosophy that, looking back, is almost impossible to believe a company was ever proud of, built around the blunt idea that injuries sold motorcycles just as effectively as trophies did. This bike delivered its power in the single most unpredictable, untamable way of any machine on this entire list. A power band that simply could not be trusted, paired with a frame and suspension setup that had no real hope of controlling what the engine was doing underneath it. Riders who actually competed on this thing at the time didn't call it fast. They called it dangerous in the truest sense of the word, a motorcycle that punished skilled and unskilled riders almost equally, because no amount of skill could fully compensate for a machine that was fundamentally, mechanically unpredictable underneath you at the exact moment you needed it most. What's remarkable, and honestly a little bit haunting, is that Suzuki kept building it year after year, essentially unchanged, while riders kept buying it anyway, convinced by reputation and marketing that danger and performance were simply the same thing. It would take years, and more than a few serious injuries, before the industry as a whole started to understand that a motorcycle capable of hurting you wasn't automatically a motorcycle capable of winning for you, and the TM400 Cyclone wasn't really an outlier. It was a symptom of an entire era. Through the late 60s and into the early 70s, nearly every major manufacturer was racing to build the fastest small displacement two-stroke they possibly could, chasing quarter-mile times and top-speed figures with almost no regard for how a chassis built for a much slower machine was supposed to handle that kind of sudden, violent power. Look at the entire 500cc two-stroke class from this period, and you'll find machine after machine that modern engineers would consider borderline unrideable. Frames flexing under power nobody had designed them to contain, tires that were never rated for the speeds these engines could now reach, and suspension systems that were still, in many ways, holdovers from a gentler decade. Riders who lived through that era don't romanticize it quite the way collectors sometimes do today. They remember it as a genuinely thrilling, genuinely reckless period, where manufacturers were essentially running a live experiment on public roads, And ordinary riders were the ones absorbing the risk every time they twisted the throttle past the point where the chassis could keep up with the engine. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that none of these companies set out to hurt anyone. Kawasaki wanted bragging rights over Honda's four-cylinder dominance. Suzuki wanted checkered flags and magazine headlines. Every single engineer working on these machines believed, sincerely, that they were building something exciting rather than something dangerous. That's what makes this particular chapter of motorcycle history so uncomfortable to look back on. The danger wasn't malicious. It was simply what happens when ambition sprints ahead of caution, and nobody stops to ask what the gap between them is going to cost. There's a common thread running through every single motorcycle on this list, and it isn't simply that they were fast, or badly built, or poorly designed. Almost none of them were poorly built at all. The Brough Superior was a masterpiece of hand craftsmanship. The Vincent Black Shadow was, by any engineering standard of its time, a genuine triumph. The Kawasaki H2 was built exactly as intended, to be the most audacious motorcycle Kawasaki was capable of producing. These machines weren't failures. They were successes that simply outran the world's ability to safely contain them, built by engineers chasing a number on a spec sheet in an era before anyone had fully reckoned with what that number actually meant for the human being sitting on top of it. And that is really what makes these stories so quietly tragic decades later. Every single rider who climbed onto one of these machines wasn't reckless or foolish. They were simply trusting an era of engineering that hadn't yet learned what we now take completely for granted. That speed without control isn't freedom, it's just danger wearing a more exciting name. Hugh Cairns didn't set out to invent the motorcycle helmet standard because it sounded like a good idea. He set it out because he watched a brilliant man die from an injury that today, on almost any road in the world, would be entirely survivable. Every rider today who clips a helmet strap under their chin without a second thought is quietly benefiting from lessons that were paid for, in the most literal and painful way possible, by the men who rode these exact machines before anyone truly understood what they were capable of. That's the part of this story I think about the most whenever I look at old photographs of these bikes lined up in a showroom, gleaming and new and completely unaware of what they were about to teach the world. Every dangerous vintage motorcycle on this list eventually led, directly or indirectly, to something safer coming after it. Better brakes, better frames, better helmets. Better honesty from manufacturers about what a machine could actually handle. None of that changes what these bikes cost, the people who rode them first, but it does mean their stories weren't just about speed and tragedy. In their own strange, quiet way, they were about progress too, bought at a price none of us would ever willingly choose to pay ourselves. If any of these stories hit you the way they hit me while I was researching them, then you already understand why I can't just look at an old motorcycle and see a machine anymore. I see every rider who trusted it, every family who waited for a phone call that changed everything, and every quiet lesson the rest of us have inherited because of them. Ride safe out there, wear the gear these men never got the chance to, and I'll see you in the next one.